Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. It appears to have been a difficult time of late for global internet giants like Google and Microsoft. Last Wednesday, European bureaucrats filed formal charges against Google, accusing it of abusing its dominance of the Android operating system, which is currently the world's most used mobile operating system. There are strong similarities to the antitrust cases brought against Microsoft over a decade ago. But at the same time, Google and Microsoft have dropped all regulatory complaints against each other worldwide. Just last week here in China, President Xi Jinping said that China must improve management of its cyberspace and ensure that content is a positive culture that is a force for good. But some foreign companies are worried about the new law that took effect on January the 1st that requires telecommunications and internet companies operating in China to provide law enforcement with technical assistance in any probe meant to avert and investigate terrorist activities. To try and clear a path through this highly complex subject, I'm happy to be joined here in the Beijing studio by Teng Jianquan, Director for the Center of Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies, and by Rick Dunham, a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. But first, let's look at this.
The European Union is broadening its battle with Google, alleging that the technology giant is abusing the dominant position of its Android mobile operating system.
We open an antitrust investigation into some of Google's business practices. The preliminary conclusions from our investigation is that these practices breach EU competition law.
The Commission alleges Google has breached EU antitrust rules by making phone manufacturers pre-install its search function and Chrome browser, and by preventing them from selling mobiles running competing operating systems based on the Android open source code. The case is the latest in a raft of regulatory problems that American tech giants have faced in Europe. Google denies the allegations and will have several months to respond to the charge. Meanwhile, back here in China, the government is seeking to phase out most outside technologies from its banks, military, state-owned enterprises and key government agencies by 2020, citing security concerns. In 2012, a US congressional report named Huawei and ZTE as potential security risks, with the result that they had difficulty in selling into the American market ever since. Meanwhile, China says it has faced a growing number of online threats from overseas and become the biggest victim of cyber attacks. In a December 16th speech at a tech conference in the eastern city of Wuzhen, President Xi denounced what he called cybersecurity double standards. Without mentioning the US by name, he said, "We cannot just have the security of one or some countries while leaving the rest insecure." China is now moving full steam ahead to ensure there will be no compromise on cyber sovereignty.
Welcome to Dialogue here, gentlemen. Well, President Obama was talking smart about how important it is to have a strong, united Europe in Hanover, Germany. Debates are flaring up across the Atlantic Ocean between the European Commission and Google, an IT giant, as to whether Google has breached European competition law and has overwhelmingly abused the Android system. Android system is, by the way, as we heard in the opening report, the world's most used operating system. What do you think of its impact?
Well, I think one thing is that President Obama talked about united Europe. Here, Europe is united against Google, which is a problem for President Obama and the United States. But I mean, to try to state it in simple English, the Google uses the Android operating system. There is an open source Android system that anyone can use, but then Google has its own, which is higher quality. It's proprietary to Google. And if for a Google phone, they want to load other apps that help Google make more money. And so what the EU is saying is they're getting a competitive advantage by doing this. It is similar, but not exactly the same as complaints against Microsoft a decade ago, where they were accused of trying to take advantage of the market to lock out competitors.
What do you think of the effort by the European Commission to file formal charges against Google? Perhaps that reminds us of what happened almost 1 decade ago when similar charges were brought against Microsoft.
Actually, this is a struggle between the European countries and the United States in business sector. You mentioned just now, this is not the first case for the European countries to fight against, the big giant in the information technology. And to my understanding, actually, this is actually a fair and square play by the businessmen in the continent of Europe and also in the United States, especially for the European countries. There are some acts, specifically targeted at the monopoly of the information technology. And Google, as the big giant in this regard, I'm sure should be targeted by the European countries for fair and square play.
Do you think this legal debate will provide Donald Trump with live ammunition against Europeans?
Oh, all Donald Trump needs is what he sees as unfair competition on trade from anyone outside Europe. He hasn't really gone after Europe in quite the same way. He's gone after Japan, China, and Mexico, but he'd be happy to do it. And in this case, it is one where Google does have a competitive advantage because it has such a good operating system, and if it bundles some of these other apps with it, they get information. They get the information rather than possible European competitors who have competitors to those competition with those apps, and they're losing out because the Google operating system is
no one
dominant.
should ever question the strong sense of patriotism among the Americans. This time around, don't you think Google and Microsoft emerge strong, united in fighting the lawsuit that is being filed by a European Commission?
No, I don't think in that way, because the business, has their own, regulations and rules in conducting their, exchanges with their counterpart from the European countries. And this might be a good opportunity for Google and for Microsoft to think about their future, strategy, not, put all the eggs in one basket, and they can put in several baskets, so they can enjoy the benefit and enjoy the advancement in this technology. So this is actually an opportunity for the big giant not to manipulate the advanced position, the dominant position in information technology. They should give further consideration about the feeding from the European countries. This is actually I think this is opportunity.
We have a sizable population of smartphones of up to 1.2 billion in China. That's a huge army of mobile phone users. However, young users, young consumers are quite divided between the users of Samsung, made by South Korea,
Android,
and Apple. Of course, Samsung uses Android, but iPhone uses a very independent operating system.
Right.
So what does this debate actually mean for the Chinese consumers here?
Well, I think it's a step before we get to the Chinese consumers. I think one thing is that you have Microsoft and Google see that by fighting each other, they are giving ammunition to their enemies, as they would see them economically, and so they want to stop that and try to present a united front going forward. When it comes to the Chinese market, Apple is looking at this and saying, could China come after us? This is the biggest market for Apple products. The Apple iPhone has been a huge hit, but the Chinese government has cracked down in recent months on several Apple products. And Apple is looking and saying, could the same thing that Europeans are doing to Google happen to us in China?
Yeah, e-books, iTunes movies have been banned by the Chinese authorities recently in what appears to be perhaps an issue of national security. For example, there's no doubt that the pervasive use of digital technology has subversively changed our way of life, our even way of thinking. But I'm afraid the Chinese authorities don't show as much interest in the business competitions as in national security or protection of cyberspace. For example, last year, President Xi Jinping said in Wuzhen, where we hosted the second International Internet Conference, that the issue of cyber sovereignty should not be ignored, because otherwise the flow of information with the West being overwhelmingly strong would do a lot of harm to the national security in developing countries in China. At the same time, gentlemen, why are Huawei and ZDF barred from the US market, citing the issue of national security? I mean, this somehow echoes the concern of President Xi Jinping about national security.
In fact, it's exactly the same argument that was made against Apple right now with the products that you mentioned. And it is political as well as economic. In the United States, it was on Capitol Hill.
Excuse me, are you talking about trade protectionism?
I'm talking about both trade protectionism and political rhetoric. On Capitol Hill, it gave the opponents of China a chance to say whatever they wanted against China, but also keeping the leading Chinese companies out of the U.S. market helps the American companies.
So it is the best way to protect the trade, to protect the local industries in the United States by using the name of security. I think Huawei has been very successful in its development of new technology, especially in information technology, and its cell phone and also some other equipment is very popular in China. And in this regard, in the eyes of the Americans, that might be a challengeable, competitor in the technology, and they try to protect their local, industries from any, entry of the Huawei and some other Chinese companies, do their business in the United States. This is actually a very tricky question. On one side is security, on the other side is business, trade.
In normal terms, I'm afraid the Chinese authorities should have retaliated by barring Google and Apple from sharing much of our market if they reject Huawei and ZDF, prevent them from entering into the US market. However, that's likely to cause strong protests from young Chinese consumers and smartphone users. So what do you think of the dilemma of the Chinese government?
Well, I think the market has spoken here, and the public has spoken, and you have iPhones. I mean, they are here. The Chinese government has both a political and economic issues here, and political also has to do with security. If the United States thinks that Huawei could give secret information to the Chinese government can believe that Apple or Google or other products could give information, that the United States government could force them to disclose information. But also, if the American products are getting the information collected, which goes into the United States computers, the Chinese government doesn't have it, and the Chinese government would like Chinese companies to have as much of the market share as possible, because again, they are under the Chinese government's jurisdiction, while an American company is not directly under the government jurisdiction.
Gentlemen, I'd like to take issue with patriotism and trade protectionism. I mean, these two issues are sometimes intermingled. For example, taking South Korea and Japan as an example, where their own automakers enjoy privileged positions. In the 1980s, of course, the US and Japan fought a very fierce legal battle as to whether luxurious brands of the automobiles should find its way into the Japanese market. Of course, the effort by the US government was rejected ruthlessly by their Japanese competitors. Having said this, why do we see South Koreans and Japanese use more of their own homegrown automobiles and smartphones, whilst in China, either in the case of automobiles or smartphones, you see different brands from all parts of the world, particularly from the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean. We are pretty open, very inclusive, but Huawei and ZDF have been ruthlessly rejected by the US, not by Britain. Britain welcomed Huawei, of course.
At least two reasons to explain this feature. The first is the home policy. I'm sure the ROK government attach great importance to the protection of its local industries and its production. So this is actually state policy that gave a very strong driving force for the local people to use their own produced auto or cell phone And another is the advantage of technology. Apple is very popular among the young guys. I'm sure the young guys do not care about the security or the protection of trade. They
do care about their privacy. Okay?
Yeah. They only interested in
the
convenience for the technology. Just because of the specific feature of the information technology. For example, this is actually a new domain for our social life. When you are in the same building, even you stay face to face, you sometimes use WeChat, tell something to your colleagues, and you would not like to have a face-to-face dialogue with your colleagues. So this is a completely new feature of our social life just because of the wide use of information technology.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Rick Dunham and Teng Jianjun. We're discussing cybersecurity and cyber sovereignty. When we come back, we'll take a closer look as to why President Xi Jinping emphasized in a recent meeting the importance of welcoming public criticism on the internet. We'll be back. Please stay with us. Welcome back. So much for our discussion about the legal battle between the European Commission and Google to have this kind of investigation against the alleged dominance of the Android operating system. Let's talk about why President Xi Jinping delivered a speech on how important it is to address public criticism on the internet. So long as I'm concerned, prior to the opening of the Liang Hui period, there were some outspoken intellectuals in China who caused a lot of debates in Chinese society at large as to whether inter-party democracy should be exercised, should be encouraged or not. They made a very tough crusade. So there's a lot of debate as to how to look at the online criticism. What do you think from the perspective of an overseas observer?
Well, one thing I see is there are multiple voices within the government on this, but President Xi Jinping was pretty clear last week when he was talking about it. He encouraged government officials to open up sites to comments. He called it constructive criticism, and he separated constructive and destructive criticism, but he was critical of government officials who do not want to listen to the public. He was asking for some sort of dialogue. Who knows how far it goes or the subjects, but it's clear in many cases there have been complaints that has been reported in the Western media about breaking news when government officials are not being responsive to the public with information, and President Xi Jinping is telling them, you can't ignore the public, you serve the public.
There's no doubt that the emerging new media oversight about the misconduct of government officials has generated a lot of front-page stories as to how to look at the relationship between the media and the government. But this time around, given the current high-profile, high-handed crackdown upon corruption, the use of new media could play a supplementary role, could assist the ruling party and President Xi Jinping in exercising the oversight. However, what do you think of the sensitivity and excessive concerns of local authorities and those who might have corruption?
This is really a tough job for the local people, for the local government. And I think the wide use of information technology, as we just discussed, completely changed the feature of media. We can say some traditional media, for example, TV, radio, newspaper, these are traditional medias, and you can control in a very efficient way after years of practice. The government can control what you should say, what you should not say, in your newspaper. This is the government control in some countries. But the social media is very different because of the connectivity, the openness to the website. You can have various channels to go to the social media and to talk about everything you would like to talk. So this is actually individual, behavior. And how can government control this individual opinion is a very tough job at this moment. So I think what our President Xi Jinping addressed this time is to regulate, to behave, all the peoples in the cyberspace, and gave a very positive, response to any, including the corruption, of our officials. So this is very important for the public, for peoples to know where to go, where not to go.
Well, both the government and users of the internet, the smartphones, may have been called ill-prepared for the huge impact that the emerging new media may have delivered in terms of its democratic oversight. What does that mean for the middle class who will have a growing sense of demanding more social justice, right, in all of a shaped society?
Well, one thing I see is almost all the examples we're talking about are individuals in China who are communicating with social media. To me, a missed opportunity so far is the government using social media to effectively communicate with the public. And I look at what President Obama does in the United States with his White House website and the multiple social media platforms they use. There's a lot of news, there's a lot that's shared on social media there, but it's all positive about President Obama. Basically, it is propaganda for him, but it is very effectively using the platforms that are there. So in China, what you have is bubbling up from the grassroots, people who are trying to communicate and the government trying to figure out what to do about it, as opposed to the government being proactive and trying to be part of the conversation or steer the conversation. And I think that's something that will be talked about more and more by President Xi Jinping, by the government in the coming year or years.
Can you trust the new media? Can you trust the honesty of the new media?
Since it's a new dominant, we should trust the new media, but we should control the new media. I don't think any other country without any control on the opinion you expressed on Weibo or some other social media. For example, in Singapore, you cannot say something in the social media, otherwise you'll be punished. And also in the United States, you can proliferate, for example, extremist ideas to the public. You also will be punished by the government. So in the recent history, we also can learn some lessons. For example, the Arabic Spring. Actually, the activists widely used the social media to manipulate the situation in some country, in Egypt, in the Middle East countries. So that's why we should give regulations, and also we should try our best to control the activities or ideas on the website.
In fact, our discussion here is focusing on the issue of ideology to a large degree. I'm not talking about the legitimacy of the ruling party here in the mainland. I'm talking about, for example, Osama bin Laden may have been killed by commando forces inside Pakistan, but the ideology he represented, or Al Qaeda and ISIL represent, may prove very difficult to root out. So the wide use of a new media may have assisted millions of young people in brainwashing their mind. I mean, this would be very dangerous, isn't it?
I think social media is a tool that has been very effectively used by extremists all over the world. It is called social networking for a reason. It allows them to create networks. And so I think you have legitimate concerns about extremism. You have legitimate concerns about facts, meaning lies being spread, and you've legitimate concern about ethics, about sexual mores, about other things that are so easy to post because we can instantly post them, because we have instant video, live streaming video, and these are things every country has to figure out. Facebook and Twitter both have their own rules. If you violate the rules, they can close down your account. The government in the United States has certain rules. You cannot post child pornography, other things like that. And so each country has to figure out how it's going to deal with it. China deals with it differently than the United States, but each country has to figure out within its jurisdiction how to deal with it.
Yeah, there's always a limit to the individual liberty. You cannot exercise unconditional absolute freedom without taking care of others' interests. So taking the terrorist attacks against Charlie Hebdo, the terrorist satirical publication as an example, there's a very controversial issue about the freedom of speech in Europe. With that, we come to the end of this discussion on dialogue about how to look at the use of new media and how to look at the debates across the Atlantic Ocean between the European Commission and the IT giant Google. See you next time. Goodbye.